Hey everyone, thank you for joining me today. I'm sorry I'm a couple minutes late. I was presiding from 11 to noon and the person who was replacing me did not show up promptly, which I've been guilty of that on occasion too. But what I wanted to do today is really lead off with three items and then take your questions. First, the very, very stirring address that President Zelensky gave to Congress this morning by a video link from Kiev. Second, an announcement by the Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security about protection of Afghans who have come to the country as part of Operation Allies Welcome. And then finally, a bit of good news that is very important to me personally, dealing with the Monacan Indian Nation, one of the tribes that I helped get federal recognition for a few years ago. So first on Ukraine. The situation in Ukraine is heartbreaking and tragic. The leadership of President Zelensky and others in the country in the face of this illegal war waged by Russia against them for no reason is heroic. And the United States has assembled a coalition of allies that is undertaking in many, many ways to assist Ukrainians as they defend their country. We are providing humanitarian aid and military aid at a very, very massive scale. We are pushing the most devastating economic sanctions in coordination with our Western allies against Russia, and those sanctions are having a huge effect. We are shoring up our NATO allies by putting U.S. troops into NATO areas near the Russian border. Some of those troops are deployed from Virginia, from the Hampton Roads area. We're doing many, many things, but what we're not yet seeing, at least not to our satisfaction, is a change in Putin's calculation about this illegal war. There were some signs yesterday that discussions between Ukraine and Russia might be at least hitting a few positive points, and we would pray that that would continue. But we need to keep significant pressure on Russia, economic, diplomatic, providing material, especially military support to the Ukrainian Defense Forces until we can find our way to peace. This morning, President Zelensky was heroic and also very vivid in both describing and then showing video of the tragedy of this illegal war waged by Russia. And he asked us to do more. He asked us to implement a no-fly zone. He asked us to facilitate the transfer of other military equipment, including aviation, so that they can better defend themselves. Just last week, we voted on a sizable military aid package. It will be between $6 and $7 billion of aid to Ukraine, of military aid, and an equivalent amount of humanitarian aid. And we just need to make sure, as we're programming that aid, that we do it in a way that is the most effective in allowing Ukraine to do what it is already doing very, very well, which is defending itself. I'm going to continue to press for sanctions, for international bodies to label Vladimir Putin a war criminal, humanitarian and diplomatic support. We must, on behalf of Ukraine, continue our support, and it is important that Vladimir Putin's illegal effort to invade another country ultimately run aground on the rocks of ruin, and it is important, and obviously we pray that that's sooner than later. Second, the Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security this morning made an announcement that the 76,000 Afghans who came into the country in Operation Allies Welcome, as well as other Afghans who had come previously, were going to be granted a status, TPS, temporary protected status, for the next 18 months. That is a very, very good news. Many of the Afghans who are here under a humanitarian parole that would expire at some point. The TPS status, which the president can grant, which the president has granted to those from other nations who are fleeing civil wars or natural disasters, enables people to work, and it gives them some confidence that they're not suddenly going to get to the end of this humanitarian period and find that they no longer have a legal status to stay in the United States. This is something we've urged on the administration together with other colleagues. I have been urging Secretary Mayorkas and the President to do this. It matters a lot in Virginia. Most of the Afghans who came into the United States in August and September came in through Dulles Airport in Virginia. 3 of the 8 military bases around the country that were used as processing centers for these Afghan families were in Virginia, Fort Lee and Fort Pickett and the Quantico Marine Base. And Virginia is one of the preferred destinations for Afghans when they finish their processing for settlement, and many Afghan families have been relocated into Virginia with great help by local organizations, churches, and families. We're doing our part in Virginia, and I'm proud of Virginians for that. This announcement today of the TPS status for these Afghan families is welcome news, and I was very happy when Secretary Mayorkas called me this morning to personally inform me of this because he knew I'd been advocating for it for some months. Finally, another bit of good news today. The Monacan Indian Nation was thriving in Virginia at the time the English arrived at Jamestown in 1607. Early expeditions by John Smith and others noticed that a thriving Monacan headquarters town, kind of chief town, was at Rassawek, which is on a point of land where the Rivanna and James Rivers come together in Fluvanna County. You know this story, that the tribes of Virginia, which are some of the most known tribes in sort of American culture because of the interaction between those English settlers and particularly the Powhatan Nation, the Algonquin-speaking nation that was east of the fall line on Virginia's rivers, even though these stories were well known and even though many of these tribes have been essentially intact in the same locations where they were living in the 1600s, they never had received federal recognition. When I came to the Senate, I made this an item that was on my to-do list that I was going to get done while I was here. I had tried to do the same thing as governor, and we kept falling short, and it was one of the first things on my to-do list when I came. It took many years, but we have been able to get 7 Virginia tribes recognized, 1 through the Bureau of Indian Affairs administrative process and 6 through an act of Congress. One of the tribes that we were able to get recognized via congressional act about 3 years ago was the Monacan tribe. The Monacan tribe is a tribe that traditionally has lived west of Richmond. They're a tribe that speaks a language that is a Sioux-based language, not the Algonquin language that's spoken by the eastern Virginia tribes. Rassawek was their principal home, but in the late 1600s, the English drove them further west into Amherst County, where they have maintained a traditional home at Bear Mountain. But Rassawek still has deep and sacred significance to the Monacan Nation. A few years ago, a local water authority looking to develop water infrastructure for Fluvanna and other counties decided that they wanted to build a water treatment plant at the site of Rassawek. And the Monacan Nation raised the sacred nature of the site and asked for it to be reconsidered. But without federal recognition, it was hard for them to get a hearing. It was hard for them to make traction. I'm really excited that today the news came in that the James River Water Authority that was considering building water treatment infrastructure there has decided to come up with an alternate plan that would not disturb this sacred home of the Monacan Nation. And it's just one example of what federal recognition has been able to do. I have been in the last year a little bit on a tour of the Virginia tribes to say, okay, 3 years after recognition, how is it going? And there's fits and starts. Starting up a relationship with a newly recognized tribe in the East was something that was a little bit different for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But my tribes have generally reported, the Virginia tribes have generally reported positives, but this is a real example of the power of federal recognition. Without it, it probably would have been impossible to stop this water treatment plant being developed on what had been a sacred site to the Monacan Nation. But with federal recognition, giving them an elevated stature and giving them more throw weight, basically, in negotiations, the tribe was able to successfully make the case to the stakeholders that another location should be analyzed. I had a wonderful experience this summer. I canoed the entire James River in fits and starts from the fall through the spring, through the summer and into the fall. And one day in August, I decided that I wanted to visit Rassawek. I asked Chief Branham and the other members of the Monacan tribal leadership to meet me on the site. And as I came down the James River and reached that beautiful point of land where the Rivanna and the James River come together, I pulled over at the site. I climbed up the bluff and stood there at that point, and on that site visited with tribal leaders about what Rassawek meant to the Monacan Nation And they told me about this ongoing battle to make sure the site could be protected. The news came out today that it will be protected, and that is good news for the Monacan, but good news for Virginia. And I'm really, really feeling good about my little role in it. With that, I'm glad to open it up and take your questions.
Hi, Senator. This is
Senator Kaine, can you hear me?
NBC 29.
This is Brendan.
29, first question from 29.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. So the White House is warning that it's going to have to stop a program next week that pays to test and treat and vaccinate uninsured people against COVID-19 because the funding failed to pass through Congress. Does Congress have any further plans to support uninsured people with COVID resources, especially if there is another surge?
We need to provide more resources for COVID, for vaccines, for testing, and for treatment. We need to do it because we certainly can't take for granted that this is all in the rearview mirror. If you look at caseloads in England, caseloads in Germany, caseloads in China, you would see that there are surges that are taking places in some parts of the world, and we have to be ready for that. We passed a pandemic preparedness bill in the Health Committee yesterday that tries to get us ready down the road, but we need resources right now. We made an effort to get significant additional COVID funding in the omnibus bill that we passed last week. There was a dispute about both the amount of the funding and how it would be paid for, but we shouldn't give up in trying to find an answer to this. I know Democrats support additional COVID funding. Some Republicans oppose, but some other Republicans on my Health Committee, for example, I think have asked some good faith questions. We want to provide funding. We're ready to provide funding. We just want to get some answers about what is our stockpile of vaccines, what is our stockpile of testing, what is our stockpile of treatments. They've asked some questions about what we have available because that is relevant to the question of the size of the investment that we need to make. And my hope is the administration will provide very quick answers to those questions, and then we as Congress will act promptly to provide the resources so that programs like the ones you mentioned for uninsured folks do not have to wind down.
Senator Tom Fitzgerald.
Hey, Tom.
Good afternoon. A question about gas prices, Senator. Today, AAA has Virginia at $4.19. That's down about 2 cents. But there has been this discussion on the Hill lately of some steps that Congress could take. Two things. Wondering if you could give us where your thoughts are on temporarily pausing the federal gas tax and whether or not the Congress should look into delaying the implementation of these summer blend fuels, which also would raise the price probably in early April.
These are all issues that are on the table, and I'm very open to them. The one thing that I want to make sure is we do things that actually drop the price at the pump. I really want to make sure that that's the case, and I don't want to do something that is like a feel-good measure but doesn't drop the price at the pump. And I had this experience when I was governor that the Virginia gas tax was much lower, the state gas tax in Virginia was much lower than the North Carolina gas tax. But the price at the pump in communities that are on the border between Virginia and North Carolina was exactly the same. It wasn't a 10 or 15 cent difference, because folks who are operating the gas stations are like, well, we're just going to charge what they're charging a mile away. So dropping the federal gas tax would stop money from going into the Transportation Trust Fund for some period of time. But if it doesn't actually reduce the price at the pump, maybe there's better strategies, and we need to explore those.
Brendan Ponton.
Yeah. Next question.
Channel 3.
Channel 3?
Senator Kaine, this is Brendan Ponton from Channel 3 in Norfolk.
Yeah, Brendan.
Just trying to do you have any thoughts on the resolution that passed yesterday in the Senate to make daylight saving time permanent and how it could impact Virginia?
This one was sort of a sleeper. It came up right at the end of the day, and Senator Rubio sought unanimous consent, and it passed on a voice vote by unanimous consent. And I will have to say, I only got very little advance notice that it was even going to be called up. It's not an issue that I feel so strongly about that I wanted to go out and object to it. I always love daylight savings time because I love being able to enjoy the nicer, weather at the end of the day and have more hours of daylight. But this was one that came up very last minute. I don't have a strong objection to it, so I chose not to object. We'll have to see down the road where it goes. Obviously, it's passed the Senate. Both the House and the White House will have to weigh in, and we'll see where it goes.
Senator Kaine,
Gilmore from Radio IQ. Jacob Cordes.
A woman reporter was asking a question. I didn't hear her name.
Jamie Benner with Gray Television.
Gray
I have a quick
TV.
question for you
Yes.
about Ukraine and Zelensky. He
Yes.
also called on lawmakers to pressure their individual states to cut ties with Russia, specifically businesses who work with Russia. How much are you willing to do that in the state of Virginia?
I think we should definitely do that. Obviously, by announcing that we will no longer import Russian oil, we're taking some steps in that regard, but I think we need to do more. And you see, the good news is you see a number of American companies, without being pressured by government, without any mandate, they are taking that step, both because of the morality of it, but also because Russia's an unreliable partner. I mean, if you're doing business in Russia, you only do it through some agreement with the government, and this government is a dictatorial, tyrannical government that is not only illegally invading Ukraine, but that is causing its own people to suffer. So what kind of a business partner is that? So I applaud the companies that have already taken steps to cut ties or back out of joint ventures with Russian companies, particularly Russian companies that are connected to the government of Russia. And I will not hesitate to use the role of my Senate office to encourage more Virginia companies to do the same thing. As I sit here right now, I don't know of Virginia companies that have big joint ventures. Most of the ones I'm aware about are in the energy industry, and many of the energy players are making those decisions to cut ties. At least a few are not. But I very much support President Zelensky's request in that way.
Nick Gilmore from Radio IQ.
Hey, Radio IQ.
Hey, Senator Kaine. The VA put out some recommendations about facilities yesterday. Could you just tell me a little bit about what you think about those and the changes for Virginia? How likely do you think that'll be implemented?
Yeah, this is a very important infrastructure committee proposal that goes to the VA. There will be significant public input about it. And then the VA itself, VA leadership, Dennis McDonough, will have to make a recommendation to the White House. A couple of items. So in Salem, at the Salem VA, the recommendation is that is a very old facility. I've toured it many times, and every time I tour, the chief officials there point out the age of the facility makes things difficult. So the proposal is to build a new VA in the Roanoke area. In Hampton, the proposal is, again, an older facility that has significant challenges. Sea level rise creates flooding risks at Hampton that are posing it some significant problems. And so the proposal is to build two new facilities, one in Newport News and one somewhere in Southampton Roads, possibly Chesapeake or Virginia Beach, that would cut travel times across the water. And there's also a proposal with respect to the Hampton VA to take some significant inpatient surgery specialties and do those at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital, which already has such a superb reputation in that area. So it's a complicated set of recommendations. So what do I think about it? We need to take the report seriously. We really need to listen to this public comment period, because there's really one standard. Will any change improve care for our veterans, or will it degrade care for our veterans? And so I'm going to be following the public input in a really close way on this, and looking forward to engaging with public stakeholders, veterans groups, individual veterans, the VA itself. The last thing is just a little bit of federal budget reality therapy. Even if you were to conclude that a VA facility is maybe so old that the best option is to build a new one rather than to refurbish or rehab, you have to be careful and not make that decision unless or until you know you have the dollars in hand to build the new facilities. Because I've seen the way this sometimes goes. could be a local school board making a decision about a school, or city council making a decision about some municipal building. If you make the decision that a facility is not optimal for rehabilitation, often you stop spending money to keep that facility operational. But if you don't have the money to build the new facility, then you hurt all the people that are getting treated in the old facility. So any discussion of closing an outdated facility to build a new one, you can't make that decision unless you know you've got the dollars in hand to build a new one. Because once you've reached that decision point, oh, this facility is going to be closed, just the reality of budgeting politics, state, local, federal, is if you've made that decision about a facility, you quit investing in it. And if you don't have the money to build the new facility, you hurt, in this case, the veterans who are getting treated there. So this is it is a very thorough and detailed set of recommendations. The public input is going to be really important in understanding the budgetary ramifications, not only of what they're proposing, but are those proposals realistic in the federal budget environment that we're in?
Andrew Kaine of the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Hey, Andrew.
Hey, Senator. You noted that President Zelensky pushed for closing the skies over Ukraine. Do you think that is going to change any minds, or is that still off the table because of the prospect of direct confrontation with Russia? And secondly, you spoke of how Virginians have played a role in welcoming Afghans. I know that folks on Ukraine's border, like our friends in Poland, have carried much of the load in helping folks who are fleeing Ukraine. Do you see any prospect of Virginia ultimately playing a role in welcoming folks from Ukraine, at least on a temporary basis?
Yeah, Andrew, that's a really good question. So you're right. Poland has been doing a lion's share of, there's as many Ukrainian recent arrivals in Poland as the entire population of the Warsaw metropolitan area. So this is a huge burden on the Poles. Much of our humanitarian aid is going to nations like Poland to help them deal with the refugee issues there. But President Biden, within the last 10 days, did grant a TPS designation so that Ukrainians could come to the United States under the same TPS program that he just announced today for Afghans. And within about a day of that, I talked to a friend at a Richmond law firm that's already working on TPS applications for Ukrainians to be able to come into the Richmond metropolitan area. So here's what I know about Virginians. When folks are in trouble around the world, we're often very, very welcoming. We have a high percentage of for example, the El Salvadoran and Honduran TPS recipients that are in the country are in Virginia. We have a high percentage of folks who've come from Afghanistan. They are in Virginia. And I've just seen again and again the generosity of local churches, local families, resettlement organizations. The Catholic Diocese of Richmond has been really, and both dioceses in Virginia have been really strong on this. So I think there are opportunities for Virginians to play a role with Ukrainians who now do have the ability to apply for the TPS status. On the first question, President Biden does not want this to escalate into an all-Europe war. That has been, we're going to do everything we can to provide Ukraine with the resources to defend itself, but we do not want it to escalate into an all-Europe war. And we eventually want Ukraine to defeat Russia, not it becoming a world war against Russia. And I think that's a wise decision, but it can also be painful. It can also be painful. The president has determined that putting a U.S. or NATO planes into creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine would necessarily lead into air conflicts between Russia and the U.S. or Russia and NATO that could then widely escalate the war. And so as of now, the idea is to surge capacity, air defense systems and anti-tank missiles and other surge capacity into the Ukrainian Defense Force. I think that is likely to be the path going forward, but the quantity and lethality of the military aid that we're providing Ukraine is dramatically escalating to give them those defensive capacities.
Thank you.
Jacob Cordes, 8 News in Richmond.
Okay, Jacob, and then I heard one other reporter.
Juliana Monsalve, Telemundo.
Okay, we'll go two more, and then I've got to get back up to the floor. So,
thank you.
Thank you, Senator. In his speech to Congress, President Zelensky called for the transfer of aircraft. That's something that the Pentagon has advised against in the past. What's your position on providing aircraft to Ukraine, and what role do you think Congress should play in deciding what aid, military aid, is provided?
I do not understand. Just this is Kaine's personal opinion. I don't understand the difference in transferring missile systems and air defense systems, which we are doing, or Javelin anti-tank missiles, which we are doing, and providing aircraft. I think Vladimir Putin knows that the United States and other nations, including nations that normally don't do this, Germany, Sweden, Finland, are transferring significant military weaponry to the Ukrainian Defense Force to help them defend their country. And I don't see the categorical difference between missiles and air defense systems and aircraft. Now, these should be operated by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, and that's the issue. The Ukrainian Defense Forces are not trained to operate traditional American platforms like F-16s, F-22s, F-35s. And so we could transfer them. They wouldn't do them much good. There are Soviet-era aviation, MiGs, for example, that they have some training on, but I do have a couple of military pilots in the Senate, Mark Kelly, for example, who says even the MiGs in Poland, the kind of weapon systems that we are transferring don't necessarily automatically work together with these aircraft, and it just, flick a switch and you can use these aircraft. And so, the issue is we want to provide them with the assets that are most likely to be helpful. Ukraine does have aviation platforms that they're not flying a lot right now. Maybe we could give them material that would enable them to fly their own aircraft more in defensive operations. I'm not a military expert in what is the best weapon system for the moment, but I do know this: the congressional commitment of the amount of aid and the lethality of aid, we're bipartisan in support of it. And we just need to have, and there is a good relationship between our Defense Department and the Ukrainian Defense Forces, and we just need to have dialogue and make sure that what we give to them, it can most effectively be used in the defense of the nation. One last question from Telemundo.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Senador, en español, dos preguntas. La primera es, ¿qué sintió usted al ver el video que presentó el presidente Zelensky en el Congreso hoy? Y la segunda es, obviamente su mensaje principal es pedirle, ¿no?, a los legisladores y al presidente que cierre el espacio aéreo de Ucrania. ¿Cree usted que hacer eso cambiaría las reglas del juego para Ucrania?
Primera pregunta. El video de la tragedia en Ucrania era bien triste. Jóvenes, nenes, viejitos, ciudades bien magníficos están destruidos en esta guerra ilegal. Entonces el video era bien difícil para todos, un momento bien emocionante cuando el presidente Zelensky está usando este video para educar mis colegas y el público americano. Entonces, bien difícil y tenemos una emoción fuerte para continuar nuestro apoyo para Ucrania. Yo creo que ahorita los Estados Unidos no va a tener este tipo de no-fly zone sobre Ucrania. Vamos a hablar sobre eso en los días que vienen, pero el presidente Biden ha decidido que la cosa más importante para nosotros es no usar aviones americanos o aviones de OTAN, pero a proveer recursos militares al Fuerza de Defensa de Ucrania, a ayudar ellos en la defensa de su país propio. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.